Never-ending story by Michael Ende. This inscription could be seen on the glass door of a small shop, but naturally this was only the way it looked if you were inside the dimly lit shop, looking out at the street through the plate glass door. Outside it was a grey, cold, rainy November morning. The rain ran down the glass and over the ornate letters. Through the glass there was nothing to be seen but the rain splotched wall across the street. Suddenly the door was opened so violently that a little cluster of brass bells tinkled wildly, taking quite some time to calm down. The cause of this hubbub was a fat little boy of 10 or 12. His wet dark brown hair hung down over his face, his coat was soaked and dripping, and he was carrying a school satchel slung over his shoulder. He was rather pale and out of breath, but, despite the hurry he had been in a moment before, he was standing in the open doorway as though rotted on the spot. Before him lay a long, narrow room, the back of which was lost in the half-light. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books of all shapes and sizes. Large folios were piled high on the floor, and on several tables lay heaps of smaller, leather-bound books, whose spines glittered with gold. The far end of the room was blocked off by a shoulder-high wall of books, behind which the light of a lamp could be seen. From time to time a ring of smoke rose up in the lamplight, expanded and vanished in darkness. One was reminded of the smoke signals that Indians used for sending news from hilltop to hilltop. Apparently someone was sitting there, and sure enough, the little boy heard a cross voice from behind the wall of books. They're wandering inside or outside, but shut the door. There's a draft. The boy obeyed and quickly shut the door. Then he approached the wall of books and looked cautiously around the corner. There, in a high-worn leather wing chair, sat a short, stout man in a rumpled black suit that looked frayed and somehow dusty. His paunch was held in by a vest with a flower design. He was bald except for outcroppings of white hair over his ears. His red face suggested a vicious bulldog. A gold-rimmed pince-nez was perched on his bulbous nose. He was smoking a curved pipe, which dangled from one corner of his mouth and pulled his whole cheek out of shape. On his lap he held a book, which he had evidently been reading, for enclosing it he had left the thick forefinger of his left hand between the leaves as a kind of bookmark. With his right hand he now removed his spectacles and examined the fat little boy, who stood there dripping. After a while the man narrowed his eyes, which made him look more vicious than ever, and muttered, "Goodness gracious." Then he opened his book and went on reading. The little boy didn't know quite what to do, so he just stood there, gaping. Finally the man closed his book, as before, with his finger between the pages, and growled, "Listen, my boy, I can't abide children. I know it's the style nowadays to make a terrible fuss over you, but I don't go for it. I simply have no use for children. As far as I'm concerned, there's no good for anything but screaming. They are no good for anything but screaming, torturing people, breaking things, smelling books with jam and tearing the pages. It never dawns on them that grown-ups might also have their troubles and cares. I'm only telling you this so you'll know where you're at. Anyway, I have no children's books and I wouldn't sell you the other kind. So now we understand each other, I hope." After saying all this without taking his pipe out of his mouth, he opened his book again and went on reading. The boy nodded silently and turned to go, but somehow he felt that he couldn't take this last remark lying down. He turned around and said softly, "All children aren't like that." Slowly the man looked up and again removed his spectacles. "You still here? What must one do to be rid of you? And what was this terribly important thing you had to tell me?" "It wasn't terribly important," said the boy still more softly. "I only wanted to say that all children aren't the way you said." "Really?" The man raised his eyebrows in affected surprise. "Then you must be the big exception, I presume." The fat boy didn't know what to say. He only shrugged his shoulders a little and turned to go. "And anyway," he heard the gruff voice behind him, "where are your manners? If you had any, you'd have introduced yourself." "My name is Bastian," said the boy. "Bastian Balthazar Bux." "That's a rather old name," the man grumbled. "All those B's. Oh well, you can't help it, you didn't choose it. My name is Karl Konrad Coriander. That makes 3 C's. The man grumbled. Quite right. He puffed a few crowds. Oh well, our names don't really matter, as we'll never see each other again. But before you leave, there's just one thing I'd like to know. What made you come bursting into my shop like that? It looked to me as if you were running away from something, am I right? Bastian nodded. Suddenly his round face was a little paler than before and his eyes a little larger. I suppose you made off with somebody's cash box, Mr. Coriander conjectured, or knocked on, or knocked an old woman down, or whatever little scamps like you do nowadays. Are the police after you, boy? Bastian shook his head. Speak up, said Mr. Coriander. Whom were you running away from? The others. What others? The children in my class. Why? They won't leave me alone. What do they do to you? They wait for me outside the schoolhouse. And then what? And then they shout all sorts of things and push me around and laugh at me. And you just put up with it? Mr. Coriander looked at the boy for a while disapprovingly. Then he asked, why don't you just give them a punch on the nose? Bastian gaped. No, I wouldn't want to do that. And besides, I can't box. How about wrestling? Said Mr. Coriander. How about wrestling? Mr. Coriander asked. Or running, swimming, football, gymnastics. Are you no good at any of them? The boy shook his head. In other words, said Mr. Coriander, you're a weakling. Bastian shrugged his shoulders. But you can still talk, said Mr. Coriander. Why don't you talk back at them when they make fun of you? I tried. Well, they threw me into a garbage can and tied the lid on. I yelled for 2 hours before somebody heard me. Mr. Coriander grumbled. And now you don't dare? Bastian nodded. In that case, Mr. Coriander, good, you're a scaredy cat too. Bastian hung his head. And probably a hopeless grind. Best in the class, teacher's pet, is that it? No, said Bastian, still looking down. I was put back last year. Good lord, cried Mr. Coriander. A failure all along the line. Bastian said nothing, just stood there in his dripping coat. His arms hung limp at his sides. What kind of things do they yell when they make fun of you? Mr. Coriander wanted to know. Oh, all kinds. For instance, Namby-Pamby sits on the pot. The pot cracks up, says Namby-Pamby. I guess it's cause I weigh a lot. Not very clever, said Mr. Coriander. What else? Bastian hesitated before listening. Screwball, nitwit, braggart, liar. Screwball? Why do they call you that? I talk to myself sometimes. What kind of things do you say? I think up stories. I invent names and words that don't exist. That kind of thing. And you say these things to yourself? Why? Oh, nobody else would be interested. Mr. Coriander fell into a thoughtful silence. What do your parents say about this? Bastian didn't answer right away. After a while he mumbled. Father doesn't say anything. He never said anything. It's all the same to him. And your mother? She's gone. Your parents are divorced? No, said Bastian. She's dead. God damn it. At that moment the telephone rang. With some difficulty, Mr. Coriander pulled himself out of his armchair and shuffled into a small room behind the shop. He picked up the receiver and indistinctly Bastian heard him saying his name. After that, there was nothing to be heard but a low mumbling. Bastian stood there. He didn't quite know why he had said all he had and admitted so much. He hated being questioned like that. He broke into a sweat as it occurred to him that he was already late for school. He'd have to hurry. Oh yes, he'd have to run. But he just stood there, unable to move. Something held him fast, he didn't know what. He could still hear the muffled voice from the back room. It was a long telephone conversation. It came to Bastian that he had been staring the whole time at the book that Mr. Coriander had been holding and that was now lying on the armchair. He couldn't take his eyes off it. It seemed to have a kind of magnetic power that attracted him irresistibly. He went over to the chair, slowly held out his hand and touched the book. In that moment, something inside him went click, and as though a trap had shut. Bastian had a vague feeling that touching the book had started something irrevocable, which would now take its course. He picked up the book and examined it from all sides. It was bound in copper-colored silk that shimmered when he moved it about. Leafing to the pages, he saw the book was printed in 2 colors. There seemed to be no pictures, but there were large, beautiful capital letters at the beginning of the chapters. Examining the binding more closely, he discovered the 2 snakes on it, one light and one dark. They were biting each other's tail, so forming an oval. And inside the oval, in strangely intricate letters, he saw the title, The Never-Ending Story. Human passions have mysterious ways, in children as well as grown-ups. Those affected by them can't explain them, and those who haven't known them have no understanding of them at all. Some people risk their lives to conquer a mountain peak. No one, not even they themselves, can really explain why. Others ruin themselves trying to win the heart of a certain person who wants nothing to do with them. Still others are destroyed by their devotion to the pleasures of the table. Some are so bent on winning a game of chance that they lose everything they own, and some sacrifice everything for a dream that can never come true. Some think their only hope of happiness lies in being somewhere else, and spend their whole lives traveling from place to place. And some find no rest until they have become powerful. In short, there are as many different passions as there are people. Bastian Balthazar Bach's passion was books. If you have never spent whole afternoons with burning ears and rumpled hair, forgetting the world around you over a book, forgetting cold and hunger, if you have never read secretly under the bedclothes with a flashlight because your father or mother or some other well-meaning person has switched off the lamp on the plausible ground that was time to sleep because you had to get up so early, if you have never wept bitter tears because a wonderful story has come to an end and you must take your leave of the characters with whom you have shared so many adventures, whom you have loved and admired, for whom you have hoped and feared, and without whose company life seems empty and meaningless. If such things have not been part of your own experience, you probably won't understand what Bastian did next. Staring at the title of the book, he turned hot and cold, hot and cold. Here was just what he had dreamed of, what he had longed for ever since the passion for books had taken hold of him. A story that never ended, the book of books. He had to have this book, at any price. At any price. That was easily said. Even if he had more to offer than the bit of pocket money he had on him, this cranky Mr. Coriander had given him clearly to understand that he would never sell him a single book. And he certainly wouldn't give it away. The situation was hopeless. Yet Bastian knew he couldn't leave without the book. It was clear to him that he had only come to the shop because of this book. It had called him in some mysterious way because it wanted to be his, because it had somehow always belonged to him. Bastian listened to the mumbling from the little back room. In a twinkling, before he knew it, he had the book under his coat and was hugging it with both arms. Without a sound, he backed up to the street door, keeping an anxious eye on the other door, the one leading to the back room. Cautiously, he turned the door handle. To keep the brass bells from ringing, he opened the glass door just wide enough for him to slip through. He quietly closed the door behind him. Only then did he start running. The books, copybooks, pens and pencils in his satchel jiggled and rattled to the rhythm of his steps. He had a stitch in his side, but he kept on running. The rain ran down his face and into his collar. The wet cold passed through his coat, but Bastian didn't feel it. He felt hot all over, but not from running. His conscience, which hadn't let out a peep in the bookshop, had suddenly woken up. All the arguments that had seemed so convincing melted away like snowmen under the fiery breath of a dragon. He had stolen. He was a thief. What he had done was worse than common theft. That book was certainly the only one of its kind and impossible to replace. It was surely Mr. Coriander's greatest treasure. Stealing a violinist's precious violin or a king's crown wasn't at all the same as filching money from a cash drawer. As he ran, he hugged the book tight under his coat. Regardless of what this book might cost him, he couldn't bear to lose it. It was all he had left in the world. Because naturally he couldn't go home anymore. He tried to imagine his father at work in the big room he had furnished as a laboratory. Around him lay dozens of Around him lay dozens of plaster casts of human teeth, for his father was a dental technician. Bastian had never stopped to ask himself whether his father enjoyed his work. It occurred to him now for the first time, but now he would never be able to ask him. If he went home now, his father would come out of his lab in a white smock, possibly holding a plaster cast, and he would ask, "Home so soon?" "Yes," Bastian would answer. "No school today?" He saw his father's quiet, sad face, and he knew he couldn't possibly lie to him. Much less could he tell him the truth. No, the only thing left for him was to go away somewhere, far, far away. His father must never find out that his son was a thief. Maybe he wouldn't even notice that Bastian wasn't there anymore. Bastian found this thought almost comforting. He had stopped running. Walking slowly, he saw the schoolhouse at the end of the street. Without thinking, he was taking his usual route to school. He passed a few people here and there, yet the street seemed deserted. But to a schoolboy arriving very, very late, the world around the schoolhouse always seems to have gone dead. At every step he felt the fear rising within him. Under the best of circumstances, he was afraid of school, the place of his daily defeats, afraid of his teachers, who gently appealed to his conscience or made him the butt of their rages, afraid of the other children, who made fun of him and never missed a chance to show him how clumsy and defenseless he was. He had always thought of his school years as a prison term with no end in sight, a misery that would continue until he grew up, something he would just have to live through. But when he now passed through the echoing corridors with their smell of floor wax and wet overcoats, when the lurking stillness suddenly stopped his ears like cotton, and when at last he reached the door of his classroom, which was painted the same old spinac color as the walls around it, he realized that this too was no place for him. He would have to go away, so he might as well go at once. But where to? Bastian had read stories about boys who ran away to sea and sailed out into the world to make their fortune. Some became pirates or heroes, others grew rich, and when they returned home years later, no one could guess who they were. But Bastian didn't feel up to that kind of thing. He couldn't convince of anyone taking him on as a cabin boy. Besides, he had no idea how to reach a seaport with suitable ships for such an undertaking. So where could he go? Suddenly the thought of the right place, the only place where, at last for the time being, no one would find him or even look for him. The attic of the school was large and dark. It smelled of dust and mothballs. Not a sound to be heard, except for the muffled drumming of the rain on the enormous tin roof. Great beams, blackened with age, rose at regular intervals from the plank floor, joined with other beams at head height, and lost themselves in the darkness. Here and there, spider webs as big as hammocks swayed gently in the air currents. A milky light fell from the skylight in the roof. The one living thing in this place where time seemed to stand still was a little mouse that came hobbling across the floor, leaving tiny footprints in the dust, and between them a fine line, a tail print. Suddenly it stopped and pricked up its ears, and then it vanished, whoosh, into a hole in the floor. The mouse had heard the sound of a key in a big lock. The attic door opened slowly with a loud squeak. For a moment a long stream of light crossed the room. Bastian slipped in. Then, again with a squeak, the door closed. Bastian put the big key in the lock from inside and turned it. Then he pushed the bolt and heaved a sigh of relief. Now no one could possibly find him. No one would even look for him here. The place was seldom used, he was pretty sure of that, and even if by chance someone had something to do in the attic today or tomorrow, he would simply find the door locked, and the key would be gone. And even if they somehow got the door open, Bastian would have time to hide behind the junk that was stored here. Little by little, his eyes got used to the dim light. He knew the place. Some months before, he had helped the janitor to carry a laundry basket full of old copybooks up here, and then he had seen where the key to the attic door was kept, in a wall cupboard next to the topmost flight of stairs. He hadn't thought of it since, but today he had remembered. Bastian began to shiver. His coat was soaked through, and it was cold in the attic. The first thing to do was find a place where he could make himself more or less comfortable, because he took it for granted that he'd have to stay here a long time. How long? The question didn't enter his head, nor did it occur to him that he would soon be hungry and thirsty. He looked around for a while. The place was crammed with junk of all kinds. There were shelves full of old files and records. Benches and ink-stained desks were heaped up every which way. A dozen old maps were hanging on an iron frame. There were blackboards that had lost a good deal of their black, and cast-iron stoves, broken down pieces of gymnasium equipment, including a horse with the stuffing coming out through the cracks in its hide, and a number of sewed mats. There were also quite a few stuffed animals, at least what the moths had left of them, a big owl, a golden eagle, a fox, and so on, cracked retorts and other chemical equipment, a galvanometer, a human skeleton hanging on a clothes rack, and a large number of cartons full of old books and papers. Bastian finally decided to make his home on the pile of old gym mats. When he stretched out on them, it was almost like lying on a sofa. He dragged them to the place under the skylight where the light was best. Not far away he found a pile of grey army blankets. They were dusty and ragged, but that didn't matter now. He carried them over to his nest. He took off his wet coat and hung it on a clothes rack beside the skeleton. The skeleton jiggled and swayed, but Bastian had no fear of it, maybe because he was used to such things at home. He also removed his wet shoes. In his stocking feet he squatted down on the mats and wrapped himself in the grey blankets like an Indian. Beside him lay his school satchel and the copper-colored book. It passed through his mind that the rest of them down the classroom would be having history just then. Maybe they'd be writing a composition on some deadly dull subject. Bastian looked at the book. I wonder, he said to himself, what's in a book while it's closed? Oh, I know it's full of letters printed on paper, but all the same, something must be happening, because as soon as I open it, there's a whole story with people I don't know yet, and all kinds of adventures and deeds and battles. And sometimes there are storms at sea, or it takes you to strange cities and countries. All those things are somehow shut up in a book. Of course you have to read it to find out. But it's already there, that's the funny thing. I just wish to know how it could be. Suddenly an almost festive mood came over him. He settled himself, picked up the book, opened it to the first page and began to read. The never-ending story. Chapter 1. Fantastica in danger. All the beasts in Howling Forest were safe in their caves, nests and burrows. It was midnight. The storm wind was twisting through the tops of the great ancient trees. The towering trunks creaked and groaned. Suddenly a faint light came zigzagging through the woods, stopped here and there, trembling fitfully, flew up into the air, rested on a branch, and a moment later hurried on. It was a glittering sphere about the size of a child's ball. It moved in long leaps, touched the ground now and then bounded up again. But it wasn't a ball. It was a will-o'-the-wisp. It had lost its way. That's something quite unusual, even in Fantastica, because ordinarily will-o'-the-wisps make others lose their way. Inside this ball of light there was a small, exceedingly active figure, which ran and jumped with all its might. It was neither male nor female, for such distinctions don't exist among the will-o'-the-wisps. In its right hand it carried a tiny white flag, which glittered behind it. That meant it was either a messenger or a flag of truce bearer. You'd think it would have bumped into a tree, leaping like that in the darkness, but there was no danger of that, for will-o'-the-wisps are incredibly nimble and can change directions in the middle of a leap. That explains the zigzagging, but a general sort of way it moved in a definite direction. Up to the moment when it came to a jutting crack and started back in a fright. Whimpering like a puppy, it sat down on the fork of a tree and pondered a while before venturing out and cautiously looking around the crack. Up ahead it saw a clearing in the woods, and there in the light of a campfire sat three figures of different sizes and shapes. A giant, who looked as if the whole of him were made of great stone, lay stretched out on his belly. He was almost 10 feet long. Propped up on one elbow, he was looking into the fire. In his weather-beaten stone face, which seemed strangely small in comparison with his powerful shoulders, his teeth stood out like a row of steel chisels. The will-o'-the-wisps recognized him as belonging to the family of rock chewers. Those were creatures who lived in a mountain range inconceivably far from howling forests. But they not only lived in the mountain range, they also lived on it, for little by little they were eating it up. Rocks were their only food. Luckily, a little went a long way. They could live for weeks and months on a single bite of this, for them, extremely nutritious fare. There weren't very many rock chewers, and besides it was a large mountain range. But since these giants had been there a long time, they lived to a greater age than most of the inhabitants of Fantastica. These mountains had come over the years to look very strange, like an enormous Swiss cheese full of holes and grottos, and that is why they were known as the Cheesy Weezies. Okay. But the rock chewers not only fed on stone, they made everything they needed out of it: furniture, hats, shoes, tools, even cuckoo clocks. So it was not surprising that the vehicle of this particular giant, which was now leaning against a tree behind him, was a sort of bicycle made entirely of this material, with two wheels that looked like enormous milestones. On the whole, it suggested a steamroller with pedals. The second figure, who was sitting to the right of the first, was a little nighthawk. No more than twice the size of the will-o'-the-wisp, he looked like a pitch-black furry caterpillar sitting up. He had little pink hands, with which he gestured violently as he spoke, and below his tossed black hair, two big round eyes glowed like moons in what was presumably his face. Since there were nighthawks of all shapes and sizes in every part of Fantastica, it was hard to tell by the sight of him whether this one had come from far or near. But one could guess that he was traveling, because the usual mount of the nighthawks, a large bat wrapped in its wings like a closed umbrella, was hanging head down from a nearby branch. It took the will-o'-the-wisps some time to discover the third person on the left side of the fire, for he was so small as to be scarcely discernible from that distance. He was one of the tinies, a delicately built little fellow in a bright-colored suit and a top hat. The will-o'-the-wisp knew next to nothing about tinies, but had once heard that these people built the whole cities in the branches of trees, and that the houses were connected by stairways, rope ladders, and ramps. But the tinies lived in an entirely different part of the boundless Fantastican empire, even farther away than the rock chewers, which made it all the more amazing that the mount which had evidently carried the tiny all this way was, of all things, a snail. Its pink shell was surmounted by a gleaming silver saddle, and its bridle, as well as the reins fastened to its feathers, glittered like silver threads. The will-o'-the-wisp couldn't get over it that three such different creatures should be sitting there so peacefully, for harmony between different species was by no means the rule in Fantastica. Battles and wars were frequent, and certain of the species had been known to fight for hundreds of years. Moreover, not all inhabitants of Fantastica were good and honorable. There were also thieving, wicked, and cruel ones. The will-o'-the-wisp itself belonged to a family that was hardly reputed for truthfulness or reliability. After observing the scene in the firelight for some time, the will-o'-the-wisp noticed that each of the three had something white, either a flag or a white scarf worn across his chest, which meant that they were messengers or flag of truth bearers, and that of course accounted for the peaceful atmosphere. Could they be traveling on the same business as the will-o'-the-wisp? What were they saying couldn't be heard from a distance because of the howling wind in the treetops, but since they respected one another as messengers, mightn't they recognize the will-o'-the-wisp in the same capacity and refrain from harming them? It had to ask someone the way, and there seemed little likelihood of finding a better opportunity at this hour in the middle of the woods. So plucking up courage, it ventured out of its hiding place and hovered trembling in mid-air, waving its white flag. The rock chewer, whose face was turned in that direction, was first to notice the will-o'-the-wisp. Lots of traffic around here tonight," he crackled. Here comes another one. Oh, it's a will-o'-the-wisp, whispered the nighthawk, and his moon eyes glowed. Pleased to meet you. The tiny stood up, took a few steps towards the newcomer, and chirped. If my eyes don't deceive me, you are here as a messenger. Yes, indeed, said the will-o'-the-wisp. The tiny removed his red top hat, made a slight bow, and twittered. Oh, do join us. We too are messengers. Won't you be seated? And with his hat he motioned toward an empty place by the fire. Many thanks, said the will-o'-the-wisp, coming timidly closer. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Blab. Delighted, said the tiny. Mine is Glakak. The nighthawk bowed without getting up. My name is Voshvazol. And mine, the rock-chewer Krakut, is Pion Kratchark. All three looked at the will-o'-the-wisp, who was wriggling with embarrassment. Will-o'-the-wisps found it most unpleasant to be looked full in the face. Won't you sit down, dear Blab? Said the tiny. To tell the truth, said the will-o'-the-wisp, I am in a terrible hurry. I only wanted to ask if by any chance you might know the way to the ivory tower. Oh, said the nighthawk. Could you be going to see the childlike empress? Exactly, said the will-o'-the-wisp. I have an important message for her. But what does it say? The rock-chewer crackled. But you see, said the will-o'-the-wisp, shifting its weight from foot to foot, it's a secret message. All three of us, who have the same mission as you, replied Voshvazol, the nighthawk. That makes us partners. Maybe even have the same message, said Glakak the tiny. Sit down and tell us, Pion Kratzar crackled. The will-o'-the-wisp sat down in the empty place. My home, it began after a moment's hesitation, is a long way from here. I don't know if any of those present has heard of it. It's called Moody Moor. Oh, cried the nighthawk delightedly, a lovely country. The will-o'-the-wisp smiled faintly. Yes, isn't it? Is that all you have to say, Blab? Pion Kratchak crackled. What is the purpose of your trip? Something has happened in Moody Moor, said the will-o'-the-wisp haltingly. Something impossible to understand. Actually, it's still happening. It's hard to describe. The way it began was, in the east of our country, there's a lake. That is, there was a lake. Lake Foaming Broth, we called it. Well, the way it began was like this. One day, Lake Foaming Broth wasn't there anymore. It was gone. See? You mean it dried up? Glakak inquired. No, said the will-o'-the-wisp. Then there'd be a dried up lake, but there isn't. Where the lake used to be, there is nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now do you see? A hole? The rock-chewer grunted. No, not a hole, said the will-o'-the-wisp despairingly. A hole, after all, is something. There is nothing at all. The three other messengers exchanged glances. Who does this nothing look like? Asked the nighthawk. That's just what's so hard to describe, said the will-o'-the-wisp unhappily. It doesn't look like anything. It's like... oh, there's no word for it. Maybe, the tiny suggested, when you look at this place, it's as if you are blind. The will-o'-the-wisp stared open-mouthed. Exactly, it cried. But where? I mean, how? Have you had the same... Wait a minute, the rock-chewer crackled. Was it only this one place? At first, yes, the will-o'-the-wisp explained. The rest the place got bigger little by little. And then all of a sudden, Foggle, the father of the frogs who lived in Lake Foaming Broth with his family, was gone too. Some of the inhabitants started running away, but little by little the same thing happened to other parts of Moody Moor. It usually started with just a little chunk, no bigger than a partridge egg, but then those chunks got bigger and bigger. If somebody put his foot into one of them by mistake, the foot or hand or whatever else he put in would be gone too. It didn't hurt, it was just that a part of whoever it was would be missing. Some would even fall in on purpose if they got too close to nothing. It has an irresistible attraction. The bigger the place, the stronger the pull. None of us could imagine what this terrible thing might be, what caused it and what we could do about it. And seeing that it didn't go away by itself but kept spreading, we finally decided to send a messenger to the Childrek Empress to ask her for advice and help. Well, I am the messenger. The three others gazed silently into space. After a while, the Nighthawk sighed. Oh, it's the same where I'm from, where I come from, and I'm traveling on the exact same route. Hoo-hoo. The Tiny turned to the Will-o'-the-Wisp. Each one of us, he chirped, comes from a different province of Fantastica. We've met here entirely by chance, but each one of us is going to the Childrek Empress with the same message. And the message, graded the Rock Chewer, is that all Fantastica is in danger. The Will-o'-the-Wisp cast a terrified look at each one in turn. If that's the case, it cried, jumping up, we haven't a moment to lose. We were just going to start, said the Tiny. We only stopped to rest because it's so awfully dark in Howling Forest. But now that you joined us, Blob, you can light the way. Impossible, said the Will-o'-the-Wisp. Would you expect me to wait for someone who rides a snail? Sorry. But it's a racing snail, said the Tiny, somewhat miffed. Otherwise, hoo-hoo, the Nighthawk sighed, we won't tell you which way to go. Who are you people talking to? The Rock Chewer crackled. And sure enough, the Will-o'-the-Wisp hadn't even heard the other messenger's last words, for it was already flitting through the forest in long leaps. Oh well, said the Tiny, pushing his top hat onto the back of his head. Maybe it wouldn't have been such a good idea to follow a Will-o'-the-Wisp. To tell the truth, said the Nighthawk, I prefer to travel on my own, because I, for one, fly. With a quick hoo-hoo, he ordered his bat to make ready, and whish, away he flew. Away he flew. The Rock Chewer put out the campfire with the palm of his hand. I too prefer to go by myself, he crackled in the darkness. Then I don't need to worry about squashing some weak creature. Rattling and grinding, he rode his stone bicycle straight into the woods, now and then thudding into a tree giant. Slowly the clatter receded in the distance. Glakak the Tiny was last to set out. He seized the silvery reins and said, "Alright, we'll see who gets there first. Gyap, old timer, gyap." and he clicked his tongue. And then there was nothing to be heard but the storm wind howling in the treetops. The clock in the belfry struck 9. Reluctantly, Bastian's thoughts turned back to reality. He was glad the never-ending story had nothing to do with that. He didn't like books in which dull, cranky writers describe humdrum events in the very humdrum lives of humdrum people. Reality gave him enough of that kind of thing. Why should he read about it? Besides, he couldn't stand it when a writer tried to convince him of something. And these humdrum books, it seemed to him, were always trying to do just that. Bastian liked books that were exciting or funny, or that made him dream. Books were made up characters had marvelous adventures, books that made him imagine all sorts of things. Because one thing he was good at, possibly the only thing, was imagining things so clearly that he almost saw and heard them. When he told himself stories, he sometimes forgot everything around him and awoke, as though from a dream, only when the story was finished. And this book was just like his own stories. In reading it, he had heard not only the creaking of the big trees and the howling of the wind in the treetops, but also the different voices of the 4 comical messengers, and he almost seemed to catch the smell of moss and forest earth. Down in the classroom, they were starting in on nature study. That consisted almost entirely in counting pistols and stamens. Bastian was glad to be up here in his hiding place where he could read. This, he thought, was just the right book for him. A week later, Voshvazo, the little Nighthawk, arrived at his destination. He was the first, or rather, he thought he was first because he was riding through the air. Just as the setting sun turned the clouds to liquid gold, he noticed that his bat was circling over the labyrinth. That was the name of an enormous garden, extending from horizon to horizon and filled with the most bewitching scents and dreamlike colors. Broad avenues and narrow paths twined their way among corpses, lawns, and the beds of the rarest, strangest flowers in a design so artful and intricate that the whole plain resembled an enormous maze. Of course, it had been designed only for pleasure and amusement, with no intention of endangering anyone, much less of warding off an enemy. It would have been useless for such purposes, and the childlike empress required no such protection, because in all the unbounded reaches of Fantastica, there was no one who would have thought of attacking her. For that there was a reason, as we shall see. For that there was a reason, as we shall soon see. While gliding soundlessly over the flowery maze, the night hub sighted all sorts of animals. In a slight clearing between Lilacs and Laburnum, a group of young unicorns was playing in the evening sun, and once glancing under a giant bluebell, he even thought he saw the famous phoenix in its nest, but he wasn't quite certain, and such was his haste that he didn't want to turn back to make sure. For at the center of the labyrinth there now appeared, shimmering in fairy whiteness, the Ivory Tower, the heart of Fantastica, and the residence of the childlike empress. The word tower might give someone who has never seen it the wrong idea. It had nothing of the church or castle about it. The Ivory Tower was as big as a whole city. From a distance, it looked like a pointed mountain peak, twisted like a snail shell. Its highest point was deep in the clouds. Only on coming closer could you notice that this great sugar loaf consisted of innumerable towers, turrets, domes, roofs, oriels, terraces, arches, stairways, and balustrades, all marvelously fitted together. The whole was made of the whitest Fantastican ivory, so delicately carved in every detail that might have been taken for the lattice work of the finest lace. These buildings caused the childlike Empress court, her chamberlains and maidservants, wise women and astrologers, magicians and jesters, messengers, cooks and acrobats, her tightrope walkers and storytellers, heralds, gardeners, watchmen, tailors, shoemakers and alchemists. And at the very summit of the great tower lived the childlike empress in a pavilion shaped like a magnolia blossom. On certain nights, when the full moon shone most gloriously in the starry sky, the ivory petals opened wide and the childlike empress would be sitting in the middle of the glorious flower. Riding on his butt, the little night hub landed on one of the lower terraces where the stables were located. Someone must have announced his arrival, for 5 imperial grooms were there waiting for him. They helped him out of his saddle, bowed to him, and held out the ceremonial welcome cup. As etiquette demanded, Vushvazo took only a sip and then returned the cup. Each of the grooms took a sip, and then they bowed again and led the butt to the stables. All this was done in silence. On reaching its appointed place, the butt touched neither food nor drink, but immediately rolled up, hung itself head down on a hook, and fell into a deep sleep. The little night hub had demanded a bit too much of his mount. The grooms left it alone and crept away from the stable on tiptoes. In this stable there were many other mounts, 2 elephants, 1 pink and 1 blue, a gigantic griffon with the 4 quarters of an eagle and the hind quarters of a lion, a winged horse whose name was once known even outside of Fantastica but is now forgotten, several flying dogs, a few other bats, and several dragonflies and butterflies for especially small riders. In other stables there were still other mounts, which didn't fly but ran, crawled, hopped or swam, and each had a groom of its own to feed and take care of it. Ordinarily, one would have expected to hear quite a cacophony of different voices, roaring, screeching, piping, chirping, croaking and chattering. But that day there was utter silence. The little night hop was still standing where the grooms had left him. Suddenly, without knowing why, he felt dejected and discouraged. He too was exhausted after the long trip, and not even the knowledge that he had arrived first could cheer him up. Suddenly he heard a chirping voice. "Hello, hello, if it isn't my good friend Voshvazol. So glad you've finally made it." The night hub looked around, and his moon eyes flared with amazement, for on a balustrade, leaning negligently against a flower pot, stood Glokok, the tiny, tipping his red top hat. "Hoo-hoo! went the bewildered Nighthawk. And again, who? He just couldn't think of anything better to say. No shit. The other two haven't arrived yet. I've been here since yesterday morning. How did you do it? Simple, said the Tiny with a rather condescending smile. Didn't I tell you I had a racing snail? The Nighthawk scratched his tangled black head fur with his little pink hand. I must go to the childlike Empress at once, he said mournfully. The Tiny gave him a pensive look. He said. I put in for an appointment yesterday. Put in for an appointment? Asked the Nighthawk. Can't we just go in and see her? I'm afraid not, chirped the Tiny. We'll have a long wait. You can't imagine how many messengers have turned up. Ho, the Nighthawk sighed. How come? You'd better take a look for yourself, the Tiny twittered. Come with me, my dear Voshvazol. Come with me. The two of them started out. The high street, which wound around the ivory tower in a narrowing spiral, was clogged with a dense crowd of the strangest creatures. Enormous beturbant jinns, tiny kobolds, three-headed trolls, bearded dwarfs, glittering fairies, gold-legged fauns, nixies with wavy golden hair, sparkling snow sprites, and countless others were milling about, standing in groups or sitting silently on the ground, discussing the situation or gazing glumly into the distance. Voshvazol stopped still when he saw them. Hoo, he said. What's going on? What are they all doing here? They are all messengers, Glokok explained. Messengers from all over Fantastica. All the same message as ours. I've spoken with several of them. The same menace seems to have broken out everywhere. The Nighthawk gave vent to a long wheezing sigh. Do they know, he asked, what it is and where it comes from? I'm afraid not. Nobody knows. What about the childlike Empress? The childlike Empress, said the Tiny in an undertone, is ill, very ill. Maybe that's the cause of this mysterious calamity that's threatening all Fantastica. But so far, none of the many doctors who have been conferring in the Magnolia Pavilion has discovered the nature of her illness or found a cure for it. That, said the Nighthawk breathlessly, is terrible. So it is, said the Tiny. In view of the circumstances, Voshvazol decided not to put it in for an appointment. 2 days later, Blab, the Will-o'-the-Wisp arrived. Of course, he had hopped in the wrong direction and made an enormous detour. And finally, 3 days after that, Bjorn Kratzark, the rock chewer, appeared. He came plodding along on foot, for in a sudden frenzy of hunger he had eaten his stone bicycle. During the long waiting period, the four so unlike messengers became good friends. From then on they stayed together. But that's another story and shall be told another time. Chapter 2. Atreus' mission. Because of their special importance, deliberations concerning the welfare of all Fantastica were held in the great throne room of the palace, which was situated only a few floors below the Magnolia Pavilion. The large circular room was filled with muffled voices. The 499 best doctors in Fantastica had assembled there and were whispering or mumbling with one another in groups with varying sizes. Each one had examined the childlike Empress, some more recently than others, and each had tried to help her with his skill. But none had succeeded. None knew the nature of or cause of her illness, and none could think of a cure for it. Just then, the 500th Doctor, the most famous in all Fantastica, whose knowledge was said to embrace every existing medicinal herb, every magic filter and secret of nature, was examining the patient. He had been with her for several hours, and all his assembled colleagues were eagerly awaiting the result of his examination. Of course, this assembly was nothing like a human medical congress. To be sure, a good many of the inhabitants of Fantastica were more or less human in appearance, but at least as many resembled animals or were even farther from the human. The doctors inside the hall were just as varied as the crowd of messengers milling about outside. There were dwarf doctors with white beards and humps. There were fairy doctoresses in shimmering silvery blue robes and with glittering stars in their hair. There were water sprites with big round bellies and webbed hands and feet. Sitz baths had been installed for them. There were white snakes who had coiled up on the long table at the center of the room. There were witches, vampires, and ghosts, none of whom are generally reputed to be especially benevolent or conducive to good health. If you are to understand why these last were present, there is one thing you have to know. The childlike empress, as her title indicates, was looked upon as the ruler of over all the innumerable The childlike empress, as her title indicates, was looked upon as the ruler over all the innumerable provinces of the fantastical empire. But in reality, she was far more than a ruler. She was something entirely different. She didn't rule, she had never used force or made use of her power. She never issued commands, and she never judged anyone. She never interfered with anyone and never had to defend herself against any assailant, for no one would have thought of rebelling against her or of harming her in any way. In her eyes, all her subjects were equal. She was simply there in a special way. She was the center of all life in Fantastica, and every creature, whether good or bad, beautiful or ugly, merry or solemn, foolish or wise, all owed their existence to her existence. Without her, nothing could have lived, any more than a human body can live if it had lost Without her, nothing could have lived, any more than a human body can live if it has lost its heart. All knew this to be so, though no one fully understood her secret. Thus, she was respected by all the creatures of the Empire, and her health was of equal concern to them all. For her death would have meant the end of them all, the end of the boundless fantastical realm. Bastian's thoughts wandered. Suddenly, he remembered the long corridor in the hospital where his mother had been operated on. He and his father had sat waiting for hours outside the operating room. Doctors and nurses hurried his way and that. When his father asked about his wife, the answer was always evasive. No one really seemed to know how she was doing. Finally, a bald-headed man in a white smock had come out to them. He looked tired and sad. Much as he regretted it, he said his efforts had been in vain. He had pressed their hands and mumbled something about heartfelt sympathy. After that, everything had changed between Bastian and his father. Not outwardly. Bastian had everything he could have wished for. He had a three-speed bicycle, an electric train, plenty of vitamin pills, 53 books, a golden hamster, an aquarium with tropical fish in it, a small camera, 6 pocket knives, and so forth and so on. But none of all this really meant anything to him. Bastian remembered that his father had often played with him in the past. He had even told him stories. No longer. He couldn't talk to his father anymore. There was an invisible wall around his father, and no one could get through to him. He never found fault, and he never praised. Even when Bastian was put back in school, his father hadn't said anything. He had only looked at him in his sad, absent way, and Bastian felt that as far as his father was concerned, he wasn't there at all. That's how his father usually made him feel. Even when they sat in front of the television screen in the evening, Bastian saw that his father wasn't even looking at it, that his thoughts were far away. Or when they both sat there with books, Bastian saw that his father wasn't reading at all. He had been looking at the same page for hours and had forgotten to turn it. Bastian knew his father was sad. He himself had cried for many nights. Sometimes he had been so shaken by sobs that he had to vomit, but little by little it had passed, and after all he was still there. Why didn't his father ever speak to him? Not about his mother, not about important things, but just for the feel of talking together. If only we knew, said a tall, thin fire sprite with a beard of red flames. If only we knew what her illness is. There is no fever, no swelling, no rash, no inflammation. She just seems to be fading away. No one knows why. As he spoke, little clouds of smoke came out of his mouth and formed figures. This time there were question marks. A bedraggled old raven who looked like a potato farm, who looked like a potato with feathers stuck onto it every which way, answered in a croaking voice. He was a head, cold and sore throat specialist. She doesn't cough, she hasn't got a cold. Medically speaking, it's no disease at all. He adjusted the big spectacles on his beak and cast a challenging look around. One thing seems obvious: Bust a scarab, a beetle, sometimes known as a pill roller. There is some mysterious connection between her illness and the terrible happenings these messengers from all Fantastica have been reporting. Oh yes, scoffed an ink goblin. You see mysterious connections everywhere. My dear colleague, pleaded a hollow-cheeked ghost in a long white gown. Let's not get personal. Such remarks are quite irrelevant, and please, lower your voices. Conversations of this kind were going on in every part of the throne room. It may seem strange that creatures of so many different kinds were able to communicate with one another, but nearly all the inhabitants of Fantastica, even the animals, knew at least two languages. Their own, which they spoke only with members of their own species and which no outsider understood, and the universal language known as High Fantastican. All Fantasticans used it, though some in a rather peculiar way. Suddenly all fell silent, for the great double door had opened. In stepped Charon, the far-famed master of the healer's art. He was what in older times had been called a centaur. He had the body of a man from the waist up, and that of a horse from the waist down. And Charon was furthermore a black centaur. He hailed from a remote region far to the south, and his human half was the color of ebony. Only his curly hair and beard were white, while the horse-like half of him was striped like a zebra. He was wearing a strange hat plated of reeds. A large golden amulet hung from a chain around his neck, and on this amulet one could make out two snakes, one light and one dark, which were biting each other's tail and so forming an oval. Everyone in Fantastica knew what the medallion meant. It was the badge of one acting on orders from the childlike Empress, acting in her name as though she herself were present. It was said to give the bearer mysterious powers, though no one knew exactly what these powers were. Everyone knew its name, Auren, but many who feared to pronounce the name called it the Gem or the Glory. In other words, the book bore the mark of the childlike Empress. A whispering passed through the throne room, and some of the doctors were heard to cry out. The gem had not been entrusted to anyone for a long, long time. Charon stamped his hooves two or three times. When the disorder subsided, he said in a deep voice, "Friends, don't be too upset. I shall only be wearing Auren for a short time. I am merely a go-between. Soon I shall pass the gem on to one warrior." A breathless silence filled the room. I won't try to misrepresent our defeat with high-sounding words. The childlike Empress' illness has baffled us all. The one thing we know is that the destruction of Fantastica began at the same time as this illness. We can't even be sure that medical science can save her. But it is possible, and I hope none of you will be offended at what I'm going to say, it is possible that we, who are gathered here, do not possess all knowledge, all wisdom. Indeed, it is my last and only hope that somewhere in this unbounded realm, there is a being wiser than we are, who can give us help and advice. Of course, there is no more than a possibility. But one thing is certain: the search for the Savior calls for a pathfinder, someone who is capable of finding paths in a pathless wilderness and who will shrink from no danger or hardship. In other words, a hero. And the childlike Empress has given me the name of this hero, to whom she entrusts her salvation and ours. His name is Atreyu, and he lives in the grassy ocean beyond the Silver Mountains. I shall transmit Auren to him and send him on the great quest. Now you know all there is to know. With that, the old centaur foamed out of the room. Those who remained behind exchanged looks of bewilderment. What was this hero's name? One of them asked. Atreyu or something of the kind, said another. Never heard of him, said the third, and all 499 doctors shook their heads in dismay. The clock in the belfry struck 10. Bastian was amazed at how quickly the time had passed. In class, every hour seemed to drag on for an eternity. Down below, they would be having history with Mr. Drone, a gangling, ordinary, ill-tempered man who delighted in holding Bastian up to ridicule because he couldn't remember the dates when certain battles had been fought or when someone or the other had reigned. The grassy ocean behind the Silver Mountains was many days' journey from this ivory tower. It was actually a prairie, as long and wide and flat as an ocean. Its whole expanse was covered with tall, juicy grass, and when the wind blew, great waves passed over it with a sound like troubled water. The people who lived there were known as grass people or greenskins. They had blue-black hair, which the men as well as the women wore long and often in pigtails, and their skin was olive green. They led a hard, frugal life, and their children, girls as well as boys, were brought up to be brave, proud, and generous. They learned to bear heat, cold, and great hardship, and were tested for courage at an early age. This was necessary because the Greenskins were a nation of hunters. They obtained everything they needed, either from the hard, fibrous prairie grass or from the purple buffaloes, great herds of which roamed the grassy ocean. These purple buffaloes were about twice the size of common bulls or cows. They had long, purplish red hair with a silky sheen and enormous horns with tips as hard and sharp as daggers. They were peaceful as a rule, but when they scented danger or thought they were being attacked, they could be as terrible as a natural cataclysm. Only a greenskin would have dared to hunt these beasts, and moreover they used no other weapons than bows and arrows. The Greenskins were believers in chivalrous combat, and often it was not the hunted but the hunter who lost his life. The Greenskins loved and honored the purple buffaloes and held that only those willing to be killed by them had the right to kill them. News of the childlike Empress illness and the dangers News of the childlike Empress illness and the danger threatening all Fantastica had not yet reached the grassy ocean. It was a long time since any traveler had visited the tent colonies of the Greenskins. The grass was juicier than ever, the days were bright and the nights full of stars. All seemed to be well. But one day a white-haired black centaur appeared. His hide was dripping with sweat. He seemed totally exhausted, and his bearded face was haggard. On his head he wore a strange hat plated of reeds, and around his neck a chain with a large golden amulet hanging from it. It was Charon. He stood in the open space at the center of the successive rings of tents. It was there that the elders held their councils, that the people danced and sang old songs on feast days. He waited for the Greenskins to assemble, but it was only very old men and women and small children wide-eyed with curiosity who crowded around him. He stamped his hooves impatiently. Where are the hunters and huntresses? He panted, removing his hat and wiping his forehead. A white-haired woman with a baby in her arms replied, "They are still hunting. They won't be back for 3 or 4 days." "Is Atreyu with them?" the centaur asked. "Yes, stranger, but how can it be that you know him?" "I don't know him. Go and get him." "Stranger," said an old man on crutches, "he will come unwillingly because this is his hunt. It starts at sunset. Do you know what that means?" Carrion shook his mane and stamped his hooves. "I don't know, and it doesn't matter. He has something more important to do now. You know the sign I am wearing. Go and get him." "We see the gem," said a little girl, and we know you have come from the childlike empress. But who are you? My name is Chiron, the centaur growled. Chiron the physician, if that means anything to you. A bent old woman pushed forward and cried out. Yes, it's true. I recognize him. I saw him once when I was young. He's the greatest and most famous doctor in all Fantastica. The centaur nodded. Thank you, my good woman, he said. And now perhaps one of you will at last be kind enough to bring this Atreyu here. It's urgent. The life of the childlike empress is at stake. I'll go, cried a little girl of 5 or 6. She ran away, and a few seconds later she could be seen between the tents, galloping away on a saddleless horse. At last, Chiron grumbled. Then he fell into a dead faint. When he revived, he didn't know where he was, for all was dark around him. It came to him only little by little that he was in a large tent, lying on a bed of soft furs. It seemed to be night, for through a cleft in the door curtain he saw flickering firelight. Holy horseshoes, he muttered and tried to sit up. How long have I been lying here? A head looked in through the door opening and pulled back again. Someone said, Yes, he seems to be awake. Then the curtain was drawn aside and a boy of about 10 stepped in. His long trousers and shoes were of soft buffalo leather. His body was bare from the waist up, but a long purple-red cloak, evidently woven from buffalo hair, hung from his shoulders. His long blue-black hair was gathered together and held back by leather thongs. A few simple white designs were painted on the olive-green skin of his cheeks and forehead. His dark eyes flashed angrily at the intruder. Otherwise his features betrayed no emotion of any kind. What do you want of me, stranger? He asked. Why have you come to my tent? And why have you robbed me of my hunt? If I had killed the big buffalo today and my arrow was already fitted to my bowstring, I'd have been a hunter tomorrow. Now I have to wait a whole year. Why? The old centaur stared at him in consternation. Am I to take it, he asked, that you are Atreyu? That's right, stranger. Isn't there someone else of the same name? A grown man, an experienced hunter? No, I and no one else am Atreyu. Sinking back on his bed of furs, old Chiron gasped. A child, a little boy, really, the decisions of the childlike empress are hard to fathom. Atreyu waited in impassive silence. Forgive me, Atreyu, said Chiron, controlling his agitation with the greatest difficulty. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, but the surprise has been just too great. Frankly, I'm horrified. I don't know what to think. I can't help wondering, did the childlike empress really know what she was doing when she chose a youngster like you? It's sheer madness. And if she did it intentionally, then... With a violent shake of his head, he blurted out, No. If I had known whom she was sending me to, I'd have refused to entrust you with the mission. I'd have refused. What mission? Atreyu asked. It's monstrous, cried Chiron indignantly. It's doubtful whether even the greatest, most experienced of heroes could carry out this mission. And you, she's sending you into the unfathomable to look for the unknown. No one can help you, no one can advise you, no one can foresee what will befall you. And yet you must decide at once, immediately, whether or not you accept the mission. There's not a moment to be lost. For 10 days and nights I have galloped almost without rest to reach you. But now, I almost wish I hadn't got here. I am very old. I am at the end of my strength. Give me a drink of water, please. Atreyu brought a pitcher of fresh spring water. The centaur drank deeply, then he wiped his beard and said somewhat more calmly. Thank you. That was good. I feel better already. Listen to me, Atreyu. You don't have to accept this mission. The childlike empress leaves it entirely up to you. She never gives orders. I will tell her how it is and she'll find someone else. She can't have known you were a little boy. She must have got you mixed up with someone else. That's the only possible explanation. What is this mission? Atreyu asked. To find a cure for the childlike empress, the centaur answered, and save Fantastica. Is she sick? Atreyu asked in amazement. Chiron told him how it was with the childlike empress and what the messengers had reported from all parts of Fantastica. Atreyu asked many questions and the centaur answered them to the best of his ability. They talked far into the night, and the more Atreyu learned of the menace facing Fantastica, the more his face, which at first had been so impassive, expressed unveiled horror. To think, he murmured finally with pale lips, that I knew nothing about it. Chiron cast a grave, anxious look at the boy from under his bushy white eyebrows. Now you know the lie of the land, he said, and now perhaps you understand why I was so upset when I first laid eyes on you. Still, it was you the childlike empress named. Go and find Atreyu, she said to me. I put all my trust in him, she said. Ask him if he's willing to attempt the great quest for me and for Fantastica. I don't know why she chose you. Maybe only a little boy like you can do whatever has to be done. I don't know, and I can't advise you. Atreyu sat there with bowed head and made no reply. He realized that this was a far greater task than this hunt. It was doubtful whether the greatest hunter and pathfinder could succeed. How then could he hope? Well, the centaur asked, will you? Atreyu raised his head and looked at him. I will, he said firmly. Chiron nodded gravely. Then he took the chain with the golden amulet from his neck and put it around Atreyu's. Auren gives you great power, he said solemnly, but you must not make use of it, for the childlike empress herself never makes use of her power. Auren will protect you and guide you, but whatever comes your way you must never interfere, because from this moment on your own opinion ceases to count. For that same reason you must go unarmed. You must let what happens happen. Everything must be equal in your eyes, good and evil, beautiful and ugly, foolish and wise, just as it is in the eyes of the childlike empress. You may only search and inquire, never judge. Always remember that, Atreyu. Auren, Atreyu repeated with awe. I will be worthy of the glory. When should I start? When should I start? Immediately, said Chiron. No one knows how long your great quest will be. Every hour may count, even now. Say goodbye to your parents and your brothers and sisters. I have none, said Atreyu. My parents were both killed by a buffalo soon after I was born. Who brought you up? All the men and women together. That's why they called me Atreyu, which in our language means son of all. No one knew better than Bastian what that meant. Even though his father was still alive and Atreyu had neither father nor mother, to make up for it, Atreyu had been brought up by all the men and women together and was the son of all, while Bastian had no one. He was really nobody's son. All the same, Bastian was glad to have this much in common with Atreyu, because otherwise he resembled him hardly at all, neither physically nor in courage nor in determination. Yet Bastian too was engaged in a great quest and didn't know where it would lead him or how it would end. In that case, said the old centaur, you'd better go without saying goodbye. I'll stay here and explain. Atreyu's face became leaner and harder than ever. Where should I begin? He asked. Everywhere and nowhere, said Chiron. Okay. From now on you will be on your own, with no one to advise you, and that's how it will be until the end of the great quest, however it might end. Atreyu nodded. Farewell, Chiron. Farewell, Atreyu, and much luck. The boy turned away and was leaving the tent when the centaur called him back. As they stood face to face, the old centaur put both hands on Atreyu's shoulders, looked him in the eye with a respectful smile, and said slowly, I think I am beginning to see why the childlike empress chose you, Atreyu. The boy lowered his head just a while. Then he went out quickly. His horse, Artax, was standing outside the tent. He was small and spotted like a wild horse. His legs were short and stocky, but he was the fastest, most tireless runner far and wide. He was still saddled as Atreyu had ridden him back from the hunt. Artax, Atreyu whispered, patting his neck. We are going far, far away. We are going away, far, far away. No one knows if we shall ever come back. The horse nodded his head and gave him a brief snort. Yes, master, he said. But what about your hunt? We are going on a much greater hunt, said Atreyu, swinging himself into the saddle. Wait, master, said the horse. You've forgotten your weapons. Are you going without your bow and arrow? Yes, Artax, said Atreyu. I have to go unarmed because I am bearing the gem. Snorted the horse. And where are you going? And where are we going? Wherever you like, Artax, said Atreyu. From this moment on, we shall be on the great quest. And with that, they galloped away and were swallowed up by the darkness. At the same time, in a different part of Fantastica, something happened which went completely unnoticed. Neither Atreyu nor Artax had the slightest inkling of it. On a remote night black heath, the darkness condensed into a great shadowy form. It became so dense that even in that moonless, starless night, it came to look like a big black body. Its outlines were still unclear, but stood on four legs, and green fire glowed in the eyes of its huge, shaggy head. It lifted up its great snout and stood for a long while, sniffing in the air. Then suddenly it seemed to find the scent it was looking for, and a deep, triumphant growl issued from its throat. And off it ran through the starless night in long, soundless leaps. The clock in the belfry struck 11. From downstairs corridors arose the shouts of children running out to the playground. Bastian was still squatting cross-legged on the mats. His legs had fallen asleep. He wasn't an Indian after all. He stood up, took his sandwich and an apple out of his satchel and paced the floor. He had pins and needles in his feet, which took some time to wake up. Then he climbed onto the horse and straddled it. He imagined he was Atreyu galloping through the night on Artax's back. He leaned forward and rested his head on his horse's neck. Gee, he cried. Run, Artax, gee, what? Then he became frightened. It had been foolish of him to shout so loud. What if someone had heard him? He waited a while and listened, but all he heard was the intermingled shouts from the yard. Feeling rather foolish, he climbed down off the horse. Really, he was behaving like a small child. He unwrapped his sandwich and shined the apple on his trousers. But just as he was biting into it, he stopped himself. No, he said to himself aloud. I must carefully apportion my provisions. Who knows how long they will have to last me. With a heavy heart, he rewrapped his sandwich and returned it to his satchel along with the apple. Then, with a sigh, he settled down on the mats and reached for the book. Chapter 3. Morla the Aged One. Charon, the old black centaur, sank back on his bed of furs as Artax's hoofbeats were dying away. After so much exertion, he was at the end of his strength. The woman who found him next day in Atreyu's tent feared for his life. And when the hunters came home a few days later, he was hardly any better, but he managed nevertheless to tell them why Atreyu had ridden away and would not be back soon. As they were all fond of the boy, their concern for him made them grave. Still, they were proud that the childlike empress had chosen him for the great quest, though none claimed to understand her choice. Old Charon never went back to the Ivory Tower, but he didn't die, and he didn't stay with the Greenskins in the grassy ocean. His destiny was to lead him over very different and unexpected pathways, but that is another story and shall be told another time. That same night, Atreyu rode to the foot of the Silver Mountains. It was almost morning when he finally stopped to rest. Artax grazed a while and drank water from a small mountain stream. Atreyu wrapped himself in his red cloak and slept a few hours, but when the sun rose, they were already on their way. On the first day they crossed the Silver Mountains, where every road and trail was known to them, and they made quick progress. When he felt hungry, the boy ate a chunk of dried buffalo meat and 2 little grass seed cakes that he had been carrying in his saddlebag. Originally, they had been intended for his hunt. Exactly, said Bastian. A man has to eat now and then. He took his sandwich out of his satchel, unwrapped it, broke it carefully into pieces, wrapped one of them up again, and put it away. Then he ate the other. Recess was over. Bastian wondered what his class would be doing next. Oh yes, geography with Mr. Flint. You had to read off rivers and their tributaries, cities, population figures, natural resources and industries. Bastian shrugged his shoulders and went on reading. By sunset, the Silver Mountains lay behind them, and again they stopped to rest. That night Atreyu dreamed of purple buffaloes. He saw them in the distance, roaming over the grassy ocean, and he tried to get near them on his horse. In vain. He galloped, he spurred his horse, but they were always the same distance away. The second day they passed through the Singing Tree country. Each tree had a different shape, different leaves, different bark, but all of them in growing. And this was what gave the country its name, made soft music that sounded from far and near and joined in a mighty harmony that hadn't its like for beauty in all Fantastica. Riding through this country wasn't entirely devoid of danger, for many a traveler had stopped still as though spellbound and forgotten everything else. Atreyu felt the power of these marvelous sounds, but didn't let himself be tempted to stop. The following night he dreamed again of purple buffaloes. This time he was on foot, and a great herd of them was passing. But they were beyond the range of his bow, and when he tried to come closer, his feet clung to the ground and he couldn't move them. His frantic efforts to tear them loose woke him up. He started out at once, though the sun had not yet risen. The third day, he saw the glass tower of Erebo, where the inhabitants of the region caught and stored starlight. Out of the starlight they made wonderful decorative objects, the purpose of which, however, was known to no one in Fantastica but their makers. He met some of these folk, little creatures they were, who seemed to have been blown from glass. They were extremely friendly and provided him with food and drink, but when he asked them who might know something about the childlike Empress' illness, they sank into a gloomy, perplexed silence. The next night, Atreyu dreamed again that a herd of purple buffaloes was passing. One of the beasts, a particularly large, imposing bull, broke away from his fellows and slowly, with no sign of either fear or anger, approached Atreyu. Like all true hunters, Atreyu knew every creature's vulnerable spot, where an arrow wound would be fatal. The purple buffalo put himself in such a position as to offer a perfect target. Atreyu fitted an arrow to his bow and pulled with all his might, but he couldn't shoot. His fingers seemed to have grown into the bowstring, and he couldn't release it. Each of the following nights he dreamed something of the sort. He got closer and closer to the same buffalo. He recognized him by a white spot on his forehead, but for some reason he was never able to shoot the deadly arrow. During the days he rode farther and farther, without knowing where he was going or finding anyone to advise him. The golden amulet he wore was respected by all who met him, but none had an answer to his question. One day he saw from afar the flaming streets of Salamander, the city whose inhabitants' bodies are of fire, but he preferred to keep away from it. He crossed the broad plateau of the Sassafragans, who were born old and die when they become babies. He came to the jungle temple of Muvamath, where a grave moonstone pillar hovers in midair, and he spoke to the monks who lived there. And again, no one could tell him anything. He had been traveling aimlessly for almost a week, when on the 7th day and the following night two very different encounters changed his situation and state of mind. Charon's story of the terrible happenings in all parts of Fantastica had made an impression on him, but thus far the disaster was something he had only heard about. On the seventh day he was to see it with his own eyes. Toward noon, he was riding through that dense dark forest of enormous gnarled trees. This was the same howling forest where the four messengers had met some time before. That region, as Atreyu knew, was the home of bark trolls. These, as he had been told, were giants and giantesses who themselves looked like gnarled tree trunks. As long as they stood motionless, as they usually did, you could easily mistake them for trees and ride on unsuspecting. Only when they moved could you see that they had branch-like arms and crooked root-like legs. Though exceedingly powerful, they were not dangerous. At most, they liked to play tricks on travelers who had lost their way. Atreyu had just discovered a woodland meadow with a brook twinning through it, and had dismounted to let Artax drink and graze. Suddenly he heard a loud crackling and thudding in the woods behind him. Three bark trolls emerged from the woods and came toward him. A cold shiver ran down his spine and the side of them. The first, having no legs or haunches, was obliged to walk on his hands. The second had a hole in his chest, so big you could see through it. The third hopped on his right foot because the whole left half of him was missing, as if he had been cut through the middle. When they saw the amulet hanging from Atreyu's neck, they nodded to one another and came slowly closer. Don't be afraid, said the one who was walking on his hands, and his voice sounded like the groaning of a tree. We are not exactly pretty to look at, but in this part of Howling Forest there's no one else left who might warn you. That's why we've come. Warn? Atreyu asked. Against what? We've heard about you, moaned Dion with the hole in his chest, and we have been told about your quest. Don't go any further in this direction or you will be lost. The same thing will happen to you as happened to us, sighed the halved one. Would you like that? What has happened to you? Atreyu asked. The nothing is spreading, groaned the first. It's growing and growing. There's more of it every day. If it's possible to speak of more nothing. All the others fled from Howling Forest in time, but they didn't want to leave our home. The nothing caught us in our sleep, and this is what it did to us. Is it very painful? Atreyu asked. No, said the second bark troll, the one with the hole in his chest. You don't feel a thing. There's just something missing, and once it gets hold of you, something more is missing every day. Soon there won't be anything left of us. In what part of the woods did it begin? Atreyu asked. Would you like to see it? The third troll, who was only half a troll, turned to his fellow sufferers with a questioning look. When they nodded, he said, We'll take you to a place where there's a good view of it, but you must promise not to go any closer. If you do, it will pull you in. All right, said Atreyu, I promise. The three turned about and made for the edge of the forest. Leading Artax by the bridle, Atreyu followed them. For a while they went this way and that way between enormous trees. Then finally they stopped at the foot of a giant tree so big that 5 grown men holding hands could scarcely have girdled it. Climb as high as you can, said the legless troll, and look in the direction of the sunrise. Then you'll see it, or rather not see it. Atreyu pulled himself up by the knots and bumps on the tree. He reached the lower branches, hoisted himself to the next, climbed and climbed until he lost sight of the ground below him. Higher and higher he went. The trunk grew thinner and the more closely spaced side branches made it easier to climb. When at last he reached the crown, he turned toward the sunrise, and then he saw it. The tops of the trees nearest to him were still green, but the leaves of those farther away seemed to have lost all color. They were grey. A little farther on, the foliage seemed to become strangely transparent, misty, or better still, unreal. And farther still, there was nothing, absolutely nothing. Not a bare stretch, not darkness, not some lighter color. No, it was something the eyes could not bear. something that made you feel you had gone blind, for no eye can bear the sight of utter nothingness. Atreyu held his hand before his face and nearly fell off his branch. He clung tight for a moment, then climbed down as fast as he could. He had seen enough. At last he really understood the horror that was spreading through Fantastica. When he reached the foot of the great tree, the three bark trolls had vanished. Atreyu swung himself into the saddle and galloped as fast as Artax would carry him in the direction that would take him away from the slowly but irresistibly spreading nothing. By nightfall he had left Howling Forest far behind him. Only then did he stop to rest. That night a second encounter, which was to give his great quest a new direction, awaited him. He dreamed, much more distinctly than before, of the purple buffalo he had wanted to kill. This time Atreyu was without his bow and arrow. He felt very, very small, and the buffalo's face filled the whole sky. And the face spoke to him. He couldn't understand every word, but this is the gist of what it said. If you had killed me, you would be a hunter now. But because you let me live, I can help you, Atreyu. Listen to me. There is, in Fantastica, a being older than all the other beings. In the north, far, far from here, lie the swamps of sadness. In the middle of those swamps, there is a mountain. Tortoise Shell Mountain it's called. There lives Morla the Aged One. Go and see Morla the Aged One. Then Atreyu woke up. The clock in the belfry struck 12. Soon, Bastian's classmates will be going down to the gym for the last class. Today, they'll probably be playing with the big, heavy medicine ball which Bastian handled so awkwardly that neither of the two teams ever wanted him. And sometimes they played with a small hard rubber ball that hurt terribly when it hit you. Bastian was an easy mark and was always getting hit full force. Or perhaps they'd be climbing rope, an exercise that Bastian especially detested. Most of the others would be all the way to the top, while he, with his face as red as a beet, would be dangling like a sack of flour at the very bottom of the rope, unable to climb as much as a foot. They'd all be laughing their heads off, and Mr. Menge, the gym teacher, had a special stock of jibes just for Bastian. Bastian would have given a good deal to be like Atreyu. He'd have shown them. He heaved a deep sigh. Atreyu rode northward, ever northward. He allowed himself and his little horse only the most necessary steps for sleep and food. He rode by day and he rode by night, in the scorching sun and the pelting rain. He looked neither to the left nor the right and asked no more questions. The farther northward he went, the darker it grew. An unchanging leaden-grey twilight filled the days. At night, the northern lights played across the sky. One morning, when time seemed to be standing still in the murky light, he looked out from the hilltop and finally glimpsed the swamps of sadness. Clouds of mist drifted over them. Here and there, he distinguished little clumps of trees, their trunks divided at the bottom into 4, 5 or more crooked stilts, which made the trees look like great many-legged crabs standing in the black water. From the brown foliage hung aerial roots resembling motionless tentacles. It was next to impossible to make out where there was solid ground between the pools of water and where there was only a covering of water plants. Artax whinnied with horror. Artax whinnied with horror. Are we going in there, master? Yes, said Atreyu. We must find Tortoise Shell Mountain. It's at the center of those swamps. He urged Artax on, and Artax obeyed. Step by step, he tested the firmness of the ground, but that made progress very slow. At length, Atreyu dismounted and led Artax by the bridle. Several times the horse sank in, but managed to pull himself loose. But the farther they went into the swamps of sadness, the more sluggish became his movements. He let his head drop and barely dragged himself forward. Artax, said Atreyu, what's the matter? I don't know, master. I think we should turn back. There's no sense in all this. We're chasing after something you only dreamed about. We won't find anything. Maybe it's too late even now. Maybe the childlike empress is already dead, and everything we're doing is useless. Let us turn back, master. Atreyu was astonished. Artax, he said, you've never spoken like this. What's the matter? Are you sick? Maybe I am, said Artax. With every step we take, the sadness grows in my heart. I lost hope, master, and I feel so heavy, so heavy. I can't go on. But we must go on, cried Atreyu. Come along, Artax. He hugged at the bridle, but Artax stood still. He had sunk in up to his belly, and he made no further effort to extricate himself. Artax, cried Atreyu, you mustn't let yourself go. Come, put yourself out or you'll sink. Leave me, master, said the little horse. I can't make it. Go on alone. Don't bother about me. I can't stand the sadness in him. Okay. Desperately, Atreyu pulled at the bridle, but the horse sank deeper and deeper. When only his head emerged from the black water, Atreyu took it in his arms. I'll hold you, Artax, he whispered. I won't let you go under. The little horse uttered one last soft neigh. You can't help me, master. It's all over for me. Neither of us knew that what we were getting into. Now we know why they were called the swamps of sadness. It's the sadness that has made me so heavy. That's why I'm singing. There's no help. But I am here too, said Atreyu, and I don't feel anything. You're wearing the gem, master, said Artax. It protects you. Then I'll hang it around your neck, Atreyu cried. Maybe it will protect you too. He started trailing the chain of his neck. No, the little horse whinnied. You mustn't do that, master. The glory was entrusted to you. You weren't given permission to pass it on as you see fit. You must carry on the quest without me. Atreyu pressed his face into the horse's cheek. Artax, he whispered. Oh my Artax. Will you grant my last wish? The little horse asked. Atreyu nodded in silence. Then I beg you to go away. I don't want you to see my end. Will you do me that favor? Slowly Atreyu arose. Half the horse's head was already in the black water. Forever, Atreyu, my master, he said, and thank you. Atreyu pressed his lips together. He couldn't speak. Once again, he nodded to Artax, then he turned away. What the fuck? That's pretty stupid, but okay. Bastian was sobbing. He couldn't help it. His eyes filled with tears and he couldn't go on reading. He had to take out his handkerchief and blow his nose before he could go on. Atreyu waited and waited. For how long he didn't know. The mist grew thicker and he felt as if he were blind and deaf. It seemed to him that he had been wandering around in circles for hours. He stopped worrying about where to set his foot down, and yet he never sank in above his knees. By some mysterious means, the childlike Empress amulet led him the right way. Then suddenly he saw a high, steep mountain ahead of him. Pulling himself from crag to crag, he climbed to the rounded top. At first he didn't notice what this mountain was made of, but from the top he overlooked the whole mountain, and then he saw that it consisted of great slabs of tortoise shell with moss growing in the crevices between them. He had found Tortoise Shell Mountain, but the discovery gave him no pleasure. Now that his faithful little horse was gone, it left him almost indifferent. Still, he would have to find out who this Morla the Aged One was and where she actually lived. While he was mulling it over, he felt a slight tremor shaking the mountain. Then he heard a hideous wheezing. Then he heard a hideous wheezing and lip smacking, and a voice that seemed to issue from the innermost bowels of the earth. Sakes alive, old woman, somebody's crawling around on us. In hurrying to the end of the ridge where the sounds had come from, Atreyu had slipped on a bed of moss. Since there was nothing for him to hold on to, he slid faster and faster and finally fell off the mountain. Luckily, he landed on a tree, which caught him in its branches. Looking back at the mountain, he saw an enormous cave. Water was splashing and gushing inside, and something was moving. Slowly, the something came out. It looked like a boulder as big as a house. When it came into full sight, Atreus saw that it was a head attached to a long wrinkled neck, the head of a turtle. Its eyes were black and as big as ponds. The mouth was dripping with muck and water weeds. This whole tortoise shell mountain, it suddenly dawned on Atreus, was one enormous beast, a giant swamp turtle, Morla the Aged One. The wheezing, gargling voice spoke again. "What are you doing here, son?" Atreus reached for the amulet on his chest and held it in such a way that the great eyes couldn't help seeing it. "Do you recognize this, Morla?" She took a while to answer. "Sakes alive, Auden! We haven't seen that in a long time, have we, old woman?" The emblem of the childlike empress. "Not in a long time." "The childlike empress is sick," said Atreus. "Did you know that?" "It's all the same to us, isn't it, old woman?" Morla replied. She seemed to be talking to herself, perhaps because she had no one else to talk to for heaven knows how long. "If you don't save her, she will die," Atreus cried out. "The nothing is spreading everywhere. I've seen it myself." Morla stared at him out of her great empty eyes. "We don't mind, do we, old woman?" "But then we shall all die," Atreus screamed, "every last one of us." "Sakes alive," said Morla. "But what do we care? Nothing matters to us anymore. It's all the same to us." "But you'll too be destroyed, Morla," cried Atreus angrily. "Or do you expect, because you're so old, to outlive Fantastica?" "Sakes alive," Morla gurgled. "We're old, son, much too old. Lived long enough, seen too much. When you know as much as we do, nothing matters. Things just repeat. Day and night, summer and winter. The world is empty and aimless. Everything circles around. Whatever starts up must pass away. Whatever is born must die. It all cancels out, good and bad, beautiful and ugly. Everything's empty, nothing is real, nothing matters." Atreus didn't know what to answer. The Aged One's dark, empty, pond-sized eyes paralyzed his thoughts. After a while he heard her speak again. "You are young, son. If you were as old as we are, you know there's nothing but sadness. Why shouldn't we die, you and I, the childlike empress, the whole lot of us? Anyway, it's all flim-flam, meaningless games. Nothing matters. Leave us in peace, son. Go away." Atreus tensed his will to fight off the paralysis that flowed from her eyes. "If you know so much," he said, "you must know what the childlike empress illness is, and whether there's a cure for it." We do, don't we, old woman?" Morla wheezed. "But it's all the same to us whether she's saved or not. So why should we tell you? If it's really all the same to you," Atreus argued, "you might as well just tell me. You might as well tell me." We could, couldn't we, old woman?" Morla grunted. "But you don't feel like it. Then it's not all the same to you. Then you yourself don't believe what you're saying." After a long silence he heard a deep gargling and belching. That must have been some kind of laughter, if Morla the Aged One was still capable of laughing. "In any case," she said, "you're a sly one, son. Really sly. We haven't had so much fun in a long time, have we, old woman? Sakes alive, it's true. We might as well tell you. Makes no difference. Should we tell them, old woman? Should we tell him, old woman?" A long silence followed. Atreus waited anxiously for Morla's answer, taking care not to interrupt the slow, chillless flow of her thoughts. At last she spoke. "Your life is short, son. Ours is long, much too long. But we both live in time. You a short time, we a long time. The childlike empress has always been there, but she is not old. She has always been young, she still is. Her life isn't measured by time, but by names. She needs a new name. She keeps needing new names. Do you know her name, son?" "No," Atreus admitted. I never heard it." "You couldn't have," said Morla. "Not even we can remember it. Yet she has had many names, but they are all forgotten, over and done with. But without a name, she can't live. And all the childlike empress needs is a new name, then she'll get well. But it makes no difference whether she gets well or not." She closed her pond-sized eyes and began slowly to pull in her head. "Wait," cried Atreus. Where can she get a name? Who can give her one? Where can I find the name?" None of us, Mola Gorgot, no inhabitant of Fantastica can give her a new name. So it's hopeless. Sakes alive, it doesn't matter. Nothing matters. Who then? Cried Atreo in despair. Who can give her the name that will save her and save us all? Don't make so much noise, said Morla. Leave us in peace and go away. Even we don't know who can give her a name. If you don't know, Atreo screamed even louder, who does? She opened her eyes a last time. If you weren't a gem, she wheezed, we'd eat you up just to have peace and quiet. Sakes alive. Who? Atreo insisted, but tell me who knows and I'll leave you in peace forever. It doesn't matter, she replied, but maybe Uyulara in the It doesn't matter, she replied, but maybe Uyulara in the Southern Oracle knows. She may know, it's all the same to us. How can I get there? You can't get there at all, son. Not in 10,000 days journey. Your life is too short. You'll die first. It's too far in the south. Much too far. So it's all hopeless. We told you so in the first place, didn't we, old woman? Sakes alive, son. Give it up. And most important, leave us in peace. With that, she closed her empty gazing eyes and pulled her head back into the cave for good. Atreo knew he would learn no more from her. At the same time, the shadowy being which had condensed out of the darkness of the heath picked up Atreo's trail and headed for the swamps of sadness. Nothing and no one in all Fantastica would deflect it from that trail. Bastian had propped his head on his hand and was looking thoughtfully into space. Strange, he said aloud, that no one in all Fantastica can give the childlike Empress a new name. If it had been just a matter of giving her a name, Bastian could have easily have helped her. He was tops at that, but unfortunately he was not in Fantastica, where his talents were needed and would even have won him friends and admirers. On the other hand, he was glad not to be there. Not for anything in the world would he have ventured into Not for anything in the world would he have ventured into such a place as the swamps of sadness. And then this spooky creature of darkness that was chasing Atreo without his knowing it. Bastian would have liked to warn him, but that was impossible. All he could do was hope and go on reading. Chapter 4. Igramu the Many. Dire hunger and thirst pursued Atreo. It was 2 days since he had left the swamps of sadness, and since then he had been wandering through an empty rock wilderness. What little provisions he had taken with him had sunk beneath the black waters with Artax. In vain, Atreo dug his fingers into the clefts between stones in the hope of finding some little root, but nothing grew there, not even moss or lichen. At first he was glad to feel solid ground beneath his feet, but little by little it came to him that he was worse off than ever. He was lost. He didn't even know what direction he was going in, for the dusky greyness was the same all around him. A cold wind blew over the needle-like rocks that rose up on all sides, blue and blue. Uphill and downhill he plodded, but all he saw was distant mountains with still more distant ranges behind them, and so on to the horizon on all sides. And nothing living, not a beetle, not an ant, not even vultures which ordinarily follow the weary traveler until he falls by the wayside. Doubt was no longer possible. This was the land of the dead mountains. Few had seen them, and fewer still escaped from them alive, but they figured in the legends of Atreus' people. He remembered an old song. Better the huntsman should perish in the mountains, for in the dead mountains there is a deep, deep chasm, where dwelleth Igramu the Many, the horror of horrors. Even if Atreo had wanted to turn back and had known what direction to take, it would not have been possible. He had gone too far and could only keep on going. If only he himself had been involved, he might have sat down in a cave and quietly waited for death, as the greenskin hunters did. But he was engaged in the great quest. The life of the childlike Empress and all Fantastica was at stake. He had no right to give up. And so he kept at it, uphill and down. From time to time he realized that he had long been walking as though in his sleep, that his mind had been in other realms, from which they had returned none too willingly. Bastian gave a start. The clock in the belfry struck 1. School was over for the day. He heard the shouts and screams of the children running into the corridors from the classrooms and the clatter of many feet on the stairs. For a while there were isolated shouts on the street, and then the schoolhouse was engulfed in silence. The silence descended on Bastian like a great heavy blanket and threatened to smother him. From then on he would be all alone in the big schoolhouse. All that day, all that night, there was no knowing how long. This adventure of his was getting serious. The other children were going home for lunch. Bastian was hungry too, and he was cold in spite of the army blankets he was wrapped in. Suddenly he lost heart. His whole plan seemed crazy, senseless. He wanted to go home that very minute. He could just be in time. His father wouldn't have noticed anything yet. Bastian wouldn't even have to tell him he had played hooky. Of course, it would come out sooner or later, but there was time to worry about that. But the stolen book, yes, he'd have to own up to that too. In the end, his father would resign himself as he did to all disappointments Bastian had given him. Anyway, there was nothing to be afraid of. Most likely his father wouldn't say anything, but just go and see Mr. Coriander and straighten things out. Bastian was about to put the copper-colored book in his satchel, but then he stopped. No, he said aloud in the stillness of the attic. Atreyu wouldn't give up just because things were getting a little rough. What I have started, I must finish. I've gone too far to turn back. Regardless of what may happen, I have to go forward. He felt very lonely, yet there was a kind of pride in his loneliness. He was proud of standing firm in the face of temptation. He was a little like Atreyu after all. A time came when Atreyu really could not go forward. Before him lay the deep chasm. The grandiose horror of the sight cannot be described in words. A yawning cleft, perhaps half a mile wide, twined its way through the land of the dead mountains. How deep it might be there was no way How deep it might be, there was no way of knowing. Atreyu lay on a spur at the edge of the chasm and stared down into darkness which seemed to extend to the innermost heart of the earth. He picked up a stone the size of a tennis ball and hurled it as far as he could. The stone fell and fell until it was swallowed up in the darkness. Though Atreyu listened a long while, he heard no sound of impact. There was only one thing Atreyu could do, and he did it. He skirted the deep chasm. Every second he expected to meet the horror of horrors known to him from the old song. He had no idea what sort of creature that this might be. All he knew was that its name was Igramul. The deep chasm twisted and turned through the mountain waste, and of course there was no path at its edge. Here too, there were abrupt rises and falls, and sometimes the ground swayed alarmingly under Atreyu's feet. Sometimes his path was barred by gigantic rock formations, and he would have to feel his way, painfully, step by step, around them. Or there would be slopes covered with smooth stones that would start running towards the chasm as soon as he set foot on them. More than once he was within a hairbreadth of the edge. If he had known that a pursuer was close behind him and coming closer by the hour, he might have hurried and taken dangerous risks. It was that creature of darkness which had been after him since the start of his journey. Since then its body had taken on recognizable outlines. It was a pitch-black wolf, the size of an ox. Nose to the ground, it trotted along, following Atreyu's trail through the... It was a pitch-black wolf, the size of an ox. Nose to the ground, it trotted along, following Atreyu's trail through the stony desert of the dead mountains. Its tongue hung far out of its mouth, and its terrifying fangs were bared. The freshness of the scent told the wolf that its prey was only a few miles ahead. But suspecting nothing of his pursuer, Atreyu picked his way slowly and cautiously. As he was groping through the darkness of a tunnel under a mountain, he suddenly heard a noise that he couldn't identify because it bore no resemblance to any sound he had ever heard. It was a kind of jangling roar. At the same time, Atreyu felt that the whole mountain about him was trembling, and he had blocks of stone crashing down its outer walls. For a time he waited to see whether the earthquake or whatever it might be would abate. Then, since it did not, he crawled to the end of the tunnel and cautiously stuck his head out. And then he saw it. An enormous spider web was stretched from edge to edge of the deep chasm, and the sticky threads of the web, which were as thick as ropes, a great white luck dragon was struggling, becoming more and more entangled as he thrashed about with his tails and claws. Luck dragons are among the strangest animals in Fantastica. They bear no resemblance to ordinary dragons, which look like loathsome snakes and live in deep caves, diffusing a noxious stench and guarding some real or imaginary treasure. Such spawn of chaos are usually wicked or ill-tempered, and have bat-like wings with which they can rise clumsily and noisily into the air, and they spew fire and smoke. Luck dragons are creatures of air, warmth, and pure joy. Despite their great size, they are as light as a summer cloud, and consequently need no wings for flying. They swim in the air of heaven. As fish swim in the water. Seen from the earth, they look like slow lightning flashes. The most amazing thing about them is their song. Their voice sounds like the golden note of a large bell, and when they speak softly, the bell seems to be ringing in the distance. Anyone who has heard this sound will remember it as long as he lives and tell his grandchildren about it. But the luck dragon Atreus saw could hardly have been in a mood for singing. His long, graceful body with its pearly pink and white scales hung tangled and twisted in a great spider web. His bristling fangs, his thick, luxuriant mane, and the fringes on his tail and limbs were all caught in the sticky ropes. He could hardly move. The eyeballs in his lion-like head glistened ruby red. The splendid beast bled from many wounds, for there was something else, something very big that descended into a dark cloud on the dragon's white body. It rose and fell, all the while changing its shape. Sometimes it resembled a gigantic long-legged spider with many fiery eyes and a fat body encased in a shaggy black hair. Then it became a great hand with long claws that tried to crush the luck dragon, and the next moment it changed to a giant scorpion, piercing its unfortunate victim with its venomous sting. The battle between the two giants was fearsome. The luck dragon was still defending himself, spewing blue fire that singed the cloud monster's bristles. Smoke came whirling through the crevices in the rock, so foul-smelling that Atreus could hardly breathe. Once the luck dragon managed to bite off one of the monster's long legs, but instead of falling into the chasm, the severed leg hovered for a time in mid-air, then returned to its old place in the black cloud body. And several times the dragon seemed to seize one of the monster's limbs between its teeth, but bit into the void. Only then did Atreus notice that the monster was not a single solid body, but it was made up of innumerable small steel blue insects which buzzed like angry hornets. It was their compact swarm that kept taking different shapes. This was Igramul, and no Atreus knew why she was called the Many. He sprang from his hiding place, reached for the gem, and shouted out the top of his lungs, "Stop! In the name of the childlike Empress, stop!" But the hissing and the roaring of the combatants drowned out his voice. He himself could barely hear it. Without stopping to think, he set foot on the sticky ropes of the web, which swayed beneath him as he ran. He lost his balance, fell, clung by his hands to keep from falling into the dark chasm, pulled himself up again, caught himself in the ropes, fought free and hurried on. At last, Igramul sensed that something was coming toward her. With the speed of lightning, she turned about, confronting Atreus with an enormous steel blue face. Her single eye had a vertical pupil, which stared at Atreus with inconceivable malignancy. A cry of fear escaped Bastian. A cry of terror passed to the ravine. A cry of terror passed through the ravine and echoed from side to side. Igramo turned her eye to left and right to see if someone else had arrived, or that sound could not have been made by the boy who stood there as though paralyzed with horror. Could she have heard my cry? Bastion wondered in alarm, but that's not possible. And then Atreyu heard Igramo's voice. It was very high and slightly hoarse, not at all the right kind of voice for that enormous face. Her lips did not move as she spoke. It was the buzzing of a great swarm of hornets that shaped itself into words. A 2 legs, Atreyu heard. Years upon years of hunger and no 2 tasty morsels at once. A lucky day for Igramo. Atreyu needed all his strength to keep his composure. He held the gem up to the monster's own eye and asked, "Do you know this emblem?" "Come closer, 2 legs," buzzed the many voices. "Igramo doesn't see well." Atreyu took 1 step closer to the face. The mouth opened, showing innumerable glittering feathers, hooks and claws in the place of a tongue. Still closer, the swarm buzzed. He took 1 more step, which brought him near enough to distinguish the innumerable steel-blue insect which whirled around in seeming confusion. Yet the face as a whole remained motionless. "I am Atreyu," he said. "I have come on a mission from the childlike Empress." "Most inopportune," said the angry buzzing after a time. "What do you want of Igramo? As you can see, she is very busy." "I want this luck dragon," said Atreyu. "Let me have him." "What do you want him for?" Atreyu 2 legs. "I lost my horse in the swamps of sadness. I must go to the Southern Oracle, because only Oyulala can tell me who can give the childlike Empress a new name. If she doesn't get one, she will die, and all Fantastica with her. You too, Igramo." "Ah," the face drawled. "Is that the reason for all the places where there is nothing?" "Yes," said Atreyu. "So you too know of them. But the Southern Oracle is too long a journey for a lifetime. That's why I'm asking you for this luck dragon. If he carries me through the air, I might get there before it's too late." Out of the whirling swarm that made up the face came a sound suggesting the giggling of many voices. "You're all wrong, Atreyu 2 legs. We know nothing of the Southern Oracle and nothing of Uyulala, but we do know that this dragon cannot carry you, and even if he were in the best of health, his trip would take so long that the childlike Empress would die of her illness in the meantime. You must measure your quest, Atreyu, in terms not of your own life, but hers." The gaze of the eye with the vertical pupil was almost unbearable. "That's true," he said in a small voice. "Besides," the motionless face went on, "the luck dragon has Igramo's poison in his body. He has less than an hour to live. Then there's no hope," Atreyu murmured. "Not for him, not for me, and not for you either, Igramo." "Oh well," the voice buzzed. "Igramo would at least have had 1 good meal. But who says it's Igramo's last meal? She knows a way of getting you to the Southern Oracle in a twinkling. But the question is, will you like it?" "What is that way?" "That is Igramo's secret. The creatures of darkness have their secrets too," Atreyu 2 legs. "Igramo has never revealed hers. And you too must swear you'll never tell a soul, for it would be greatly to Igramo's disadvantage if it were known. Yes, greatly to her disadvantage." "I swear. Speak." The great steel blue face leaned forward just a little and buzzed almost inaudibly. "You must let Igramo bite you." Atreyu shrank back in horror. "Igramo's poison," the voice went on, "kills within an hour. But to one who has it inside him, it gives the power to wish himself in any part of Fantastica he chooses. Imagine if that were known. All Igramo's victims would escape her." "An hour?" cried Atreyu. "What can I do in an hour?" "Well," buzzed the swarm, at least it's more than all the hours remaining to you here." Atreyu struggled with himself. "Will you set the luck dragon free if I ask it in the name of the childlike Empress?" he finally asked. "No," said the face. "You have no right to ask that of Igramo, even if you are wearing Aurin, the gem. The childlike Empress takes us all as we were. The childlike Empress takes us all as we are. That's why Igramo respects her emblem." Atreyu was still standing with bowed head. Igramo had spoken the truth. He couldn't save the white luck dragon. His own wishes didn't count. He looked up and said, "Do what you suggested." Instantly, the steel blue cloud descended on him and enveloped him on all sides. He felt a numbing pain in the left shoulder. His last thought was to the Southern Oracle. Then the world went black before his eyes. When the wolf reached the spot a short time later, he saw the giant spider web, but there was no one in sight. There the trail he had been following broke off, and try as he might, he could not find it again. Bastian stopped reading. He felt miserable, as though he himself had Igramo's poison inside him. "Thank God I am not in Fantastica," he muttered. "Luckily, such monsters don't exist in reality. Anyway, it's only a story." But it was only a story. How did it happen that Igramo, and probably Atreo as well, had heard Bastian's cry of terror? Little by little, this book was beginning to give him a spooky feeling. Chapter 5. The Nomics. Ever so slowly, Atreo awoke to the world. He saw that he was still in the mountains, and for a terrible moment he suspected that Igramo had deceived him. But these, he soon realized, were entirely different mountains. They seemed to consist of great rusted blocks of stone, piled in such a way as to form strange towers and pyramids. In between these structures, the ground was covered with bushes and shrubbery. The air was blazing hot. The country was bathed in the glaring sunlight. Shading his eyes with his hand, Atreo looked around him and discovered, about a mile away, an irregularly shaped arc, perhaps 100 feet high. It too appeared to consist of piled stone blocks. Could that be the entrance to the Southern Oracle? As far as he could see, there was nothing behind the arc, only an endless empty plain, no building, no temple, no grove, nothing suggesting an oracle. Suddenly, while he was wondering what to do, he heard a deep, bronze-like voice. "Atreo," and then again, "Atreo." Turning around, he saw the white luck dragon emerging from one of the rusted towers. Blood was pouring from his wounds, and he was so weak he could barely drag himself along. "Here I am, Atreo," he said, merely winking one of his ruby red eyes. And you needn't be so surprised. I was pretty well paralyzed when I was caught in that spider web, but I heard everything Igramo said to you. So I thought to myself, she has bitten me too after all, so why shouldn't I take advantage of the secret as well? That's how I got away from her. Atreo was overjoyed. "I hated leaving you to Igramo," he said, "but what could I do?" "Nothing," said the luck dragon. "You've saved my life all the same, even if I had nothing to do with it." And again he winked, this time with the other eye. "Saved your life," Atreo repeated, "for an hour. That's all we have left. I can feel Igramo's poison burning my heart away." "Every poison has its antidote," said the white dragon. "Everything will turn out alright, you'll see." "I can't imagine how," said Atreo. "Neither can I," said the luck dragon, "but that's the wonderful part of it. From now on you'll succeed in everything you attempt, because I am a luck dragon. Even when I was caught in a web, I didn't give up hope, and as you see, I was right." Atreo smiled. "Tell me, why did you wish yourself here and not in some other place where you might have been cured?" "My life belongs to you. Cured. My life belongs to you," said the dragon, if you accept it. "I thought you'd need a mount for this great quest of yours, and you'll soon see that crawling around the country on two legs, or even galloping on a good horse, can't hold a candle to whizzing through the air on the back of a luck dragon. Are you partners?" "We are partners," said Atreo. "By the way," said the dragon, "my name is Falcor. Nice to meet you." "Glad to meet you," said Atreo. "But while we're talking, what little time we have left is slipping away. I've got to do something. But what?" "Have luck," said Falcor. "What else?" But Atreo heard no more. He had fallen down and lay motionless in the soft folds of the dragon's body. Igramo's poison was taking effect. When Atreo, no one knows how much later, opened his eyes again, he saw nothing but a very strange face bent over him. It was the wrinkled, shrivelest face he had ever seen, and only about the size of a fist. It was as brown as a baked apple, and the eyes in it glittered like stars. The head was covered with a bonnet made of withered leaves. Atreo felt a little drinking cup held to his lips. Nice medicine, good medicine, mumbled the wrinkled little lips in the shriveled face. Just drink, child, do you good. Atreo sipped. It tastes strange, kind of sweet and sour. Atreo found it painful to speak. What about the white dragon? He asked. Doing fine, the voice whispered. Don't worry, my boy. You'll get well. You'll both get well. The worst is over. Just drink, drink. Atreo took another swallow and again sleep overcame him, but this time it was the deep, refreshing sleep of recovery. The clock in the belfry struck 2. Bastian couldn't hold it in any longer. He simply had to go. He had felt the need for quite some time, but he hadn't been able to stop reading. Besides, he had been afraid to go downstairs. He told himself that there was nothing to worry about, that the building was deserted, that no one would see him. But still, he was afraid, and as if the school were a person watching him. But in the end, there was no help for it. He just had to go. He set the open book down on the mat, went to the door and listened with pounding heart. Nothing. He slid the bolt and slowly turned the big key in the lock. When he pressed the handle, the door opened, creaking loudly. He padded out on his stocking feet, leaving the door behind him open to avoid unnecessary noise. He crept down the stairs to the second floor. The student's toilet was at the other end of the long corridor with the spinac green classroom doors. Racing against time, Bastian ran as fast as he could, and just made it. As he sat there, he wondered why heroes in stories like the ones he was reading never had to worry about such problems. Once, when he was much younger, he had asked his religion teacher if Jesus Christ had to go like an Once, when he was much younger, he had asked his religion teacher if Jesus Christ had to go like an ordinary person. After all, he had taken food and drink like everyone else. The class had howled with laughter, and the teacher, instead of an answer, had given him several demerits for insolence. He hadn't meant to be insolent, of course. Probably, Bastian now said to himself, these things are just too unimportant to be mentioned in stories. Yet for him they could be of the most pressing and embarrassing importance. He was finished. He pulled the chain and was about to leave when he heard steps in the corridor outside. One classroom door after another was opened and closed, and the steps came closer and closer. Bastian's heart pounded in his throat. Where could he hide? He stood glued to the spot as though paralyzed. The washroom door opened, luckily in such a way as to shield Bastian. The janitor came in. One by one he looked into the stalls. When he came to the one where the water was still running and the chain swaying a little, he hesitated for a moment and mumbled something to himself. But when the water stopped running, he shrugged his shoulders and went out. His steps died away on the stairs. Bastian hadn't dared breathe the whole time, and now he gasped for air. He noticed that his knees were trembling. As fast as possible, he padded down the corridor with the spinac green doors, up the stairs and back into the attic. Only when the door was locked and bolted behind him did he relax. With a deep sigh, he settled back on his pile of mats, wrapped himself in his army blankets and reached for the book. When Atreo awoke for the second time, he felt perfectly rested and well. He sat up. It was night. The moon was shining bright, and Atreo saw he was in the same place where he and the white dragon had collapsed. Falkor was still lying there. His breathing came deep and easy, and he seemed to be fast asleep. His wounds had been dressed. Atreo noticed that his own shoulder had been dressed the same way, not with cloth but with herbs and plant fibers. Only a few steps away there was a small cave from which issued a faint beam of light. Taking care not to move his left arm, Atreo stood up cautiously and approached the cave. Bending down, for the entrance was very low, he saw a room that looked like an alchemist's workshop in miniature. At the back an open fire was crackling merrily. Crucibles, retorts and strangely shaped flasks were scattered all about. Bundles of dried plants were piled on shelves. The little table in the middle of the room and the other furniture seemed to be made of root wood, crudely nailed together. Atreyu had a cough, and then he saw a little man sitting in an armchair by the fire. The little man's hat had been carved from a root and looked like an inverted pipe bowl. The face was as brown and shriveled as the face Atreyu had seen leaning over him when he first woke up. But this one was wearing big eyeglasses, and the features seemed sharper and more anxious. The little man was reading a big book that was lying in his lap. Then a second little figure, which Atreyu recognized as the one that had bent over him, came waddling out of another room. Now Atreyu saw that this little person was a woman. Apart from her bonnet of leaves, she, like the man in the armchair, was wearing a kind of monk's robe, which also seemed to be made of withered leaves. Humming merrily, she rubbed her hands and busied herself with a kettle that was hanging over the fire. Neither of the little people would have reached up to Atreyu's knee. Obviously they belonged to the widely ramified family of the gnomes, though to a rather obscure branch. "Woman," said the little man testily, get out of my light. You are interfering with my research." "You and your research," said the woman. "Who cares about that? The important thing is my health elixir. Those two outside are in urgent need for it." "Those two," said the man irritably, "will be far more in need of my help and advice." "Maybe so," said the little woman, "but not until they are well. Move over, old man." Grumbling, the little man moved his chair a short distance from the fire. Atreyu cleared his throat to call attention to his presence. The two gnomes looked around. "He's already well," said the little man. "Now it's my turn." "Certainly not," the little woman hissed. "He'll be well when I say so. It'll be your turn when I say it's your turn." She turned to Atreyu. "We could invite you in, but it's not quite big enough, is it? Just a moment. We shall come out to you." Taking a small mortar, she ground something or other into a powder, which she tossed in the kettle. Then she washed her hands, dried them on her robe, and said to the little man, Stay here until I call you, Engiwook. Understood? Understand?" "Yes, Urgul, I understand," the little man grumbled. "I understand only too well." The female gnome came out of the cave and looked up at The female gnome came out of the cave and looked up at Atreyu from under knitted brows. Well, we seem to be getting better, don't we?" Atreyu nodded. The gnome climbed up on a rocky ledge, level with Atreyu's face, and sat down. "No pain?" she asked. "None worth mentioning," Atreyu answered. "Nonsense," the old woman snapped. "Does it hurt or doesn't it?" "It still hurts," said Atreyu, "but it doesn't matter. Not to you perhaps, but it does to me. Since when does the patient tell the doctor what matters? What do you know about it? If it's to get well, it has to hurt. If it stopped hurting, your arm would be dead." "I'm sorry," said Atreyu, who felt like a scolded child. "I only wanted to say, that is, I wanted to thank you." "What for?" said Urgul impatiently. "I'm a healer after all. I've only done my professional duty. Besides, Engiwook, that's my old man, saw the glory hanging on your neck. So what would you expect?" "What about Falkor?" Atreyu asked. How's he getting along?" "Falkor? Who's that?" "The white luck dragon." "Oh, I don't know yet. Took a little more punishment than you. But then he's bigger and stronger, so he ought to make it." "Why not? Needs a little more rest. Where do you ever pick up that poison? And where have you come from all of a sudden? And where are you going? And who are you in the first place?" Engiwook was standing in the mouth of the cave. He listened as Atreyu answered Urgul's questions. When Urgul opened her mouth to speak again, he shouted, "Hold your tongue, woman. Now it's my turn." Removing his pipe bowl hat, he scratched his bald head and said, "Don't let her tone bother you, Atreyu. Old Urgul is a little crude, but she means no harm. My name is Engiwook. We are the well-known Nomics. Ever heard of us? Ever hear of us?" "No," Atreyu confessed. Engiwook seemed rather offended. "Oh well," he said. "Apparently you don't move in scientific circles, or someone would undoubtedly have told you that you couldn't find a better advisor than yours truly if you're looking for Ulala in the Southern Oracle. You've come to the right address, my boy." "Don't give yourself airs," Urgul broke in. Then she climbed down from her ledge and, grumbling to herself, vanished into a cave. Engyuk ignored her comment. I can explain everything, he went on. I have studied the question all my life, inside and out. I set up my observatory just for that. I am in the last stage of a great scientific work on the oracle. The Riddle of Uylala, solved by Professor Engyuk. That's the title. Sounds alright, doesn't it? To be published in the very near future. Unfortunately, a few details are still lacking. You can help me, my boy. An observatory? Asked Atreyu, who had never heard the word. Engyuk nodded and, beaming with pride, motioned Atreyu to follow him. A narrow path twined its way upward between great stone blocks. In some places, where the grade was especially steep, tiny steps had been cut out of the stone. Of course, they were much too small for Atreyu's feet, and he simply stepped over them. Even so, he had a hard time keeping up with the gnome. Bright moonlight tonight, said Engyuk. You'll see them all right. See who? Atreyu asked. Uylala? Engyuk only frowned and shook his head. At last they came to the top of the hill. The ground was flat, but on one side there was a natural stone parapet. In the middle of this wall there was a hole, obviously the work of Norman hands. And behind the hole, on a stand made of rootwood, stood a small telescope. Engyuk looked through the telescope and made a slight adjustment by turning some screws. Then he nodded with satisfaction and invited Atreyu to look. To put himself on a level with it, Atreyu had to lie down on the ground and prop himself on his elbows. The telescope was aimed at the great stone arc, or more specifically at the lower part of the left pillar. And besides this pillar, as Atreyu now saw, an enormous sphinx was sitting motionless in the moonlight. The forepaws on which she was propped were those of a lion. The hindquarters were those of a bull. On her back she bore the wings of an eagle, and her face was that of a human woman. In form at any rate, for the expression was far from human. It was hard to tell whether this face was smiling or whether it expressed deep grief or utter indifference. After looking at it for some time, Atreyu seemed to see abysmal wickedness and cruelty, but a moment later he had to correct his impression, for he found only unruffled calm. Don't bother, he heard the gnome's deep voice in his ear. You won't solve it. It's the same way with everyone. I've observed it all my life and I haven't found the answer. Now for the other one. He turned one of the screws. The image passed the opening of the arc, through which one saw only the empty plain. Then the right-hand pillar came into Atreyu's view, and there, in the same posture, sat a second sphinx. The enormous body shimmered like liquid silver in the moonlight. She seemed to be staring fixedly at the first, just as the first was gazing fixedly at her. Are they stages? Asked Atreyu, unable to avert his eyes. Oh no, said Engyuk with a giggle. They are real-life sphinxes, very much alive. You've seen enough for now. Come, we'll go down. I'll explain everything. And he held his hand in front of the telescope so that Atreyu could see no more. Neither spoke on the way back. I'll stop here, I think.